Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can see and hear me okay, and I'm going to try and share my screen. But once I've shared my screen,
Yes, ma'am, we can see, ma'am.
Yeah, because I can't see you now. I'm sharing my screen, so somebody will need to shout if something goes wrong. Okay, so that's who I am, and I just thought I'd give you an image of Royal Holloway, because one of the things that I'm going to be talking about inevitably today is spectacle. And I don't actually teach in that building, but I do go there quite a lot. Students live in that building, and it is certainly spectacular. Okay, so now I can't actually get the slideshow to work. Right, so there we go. So I'm talking about Shakespeare, environmental sustainability, both in terms of Shakespeare and in terms of today. A responsibility in theatre making, which I think is becoming something we really do need to take very seriously. And I've got there a greened out copy of the frontispiece for the first folio, because I'm going to try and avoid greenwash. But I just wanted to say that I have researched the stage history of Twelfth Night in production a great deal, and I've written a book on it. I've seen more productions of Twelfth Night than is perhaps quite healthy. But Twelfth Night, I think, is a very, very interesting text to look at in terms of environmental sustainability and responsibility in theatre making. So I'm fortunate enough to teach in a drama department. And that means that when I'm teaching, I'm working with creative young people who are full of theatrical intelligence. That means that they will look at a play text and they will immediately start asking questions about the staging challenges and the opportunities. They understand that delivery of a line will affect meaning, and they understand that dramaturgy, that is the cutting, the reshaping, the remodeling of the text to speak to a contemporary moment, will create certain emphases whilst suppressing other elements. So what you see in the theatre is always an adaptation of sorts, even if it says it's just a production. And my students and I are currently exploring Twelfth Night. And one reason I think it's a good thing to go back to Shakespeare is because Vicky Angelaki, who wrote a very, very important book called Theatre and Environment, has really encouraged us to go back to the canon. She says we need to return to the canon, revisit, reread, and revise. That happens in theatre practice, of course. But what I want to do is to think about the kind of environmental implications of that. It's just coincidence that the cover of my book was in green. Okay, so that's the Reconstructed Globe Playhouse. And the reason that I want us to look at that is because it was made of wood, other things as well, plaster, but wood. So Shakespeare is a really useful focus for thinking about theatre and environmental sustainability, because first and foremost, as many eco-critics have pointed out, many of his texts are marked by environmental considerations. In particular, it's important to note that his theatrical career took place during the first major deforestation in Europe. This was also a period of climate disruption and famine, and timber shortages pushed up prices, and Shakespeare and his company became involved in, to me, one of the most amazing recycling projects in theatre history. So Shakespeare's Bareboards anti-illusionistic playhouse was, because it was built of wood, I think it's really important to think of the performances as being haunted by the wood, the timber that had created this building. But the wood became extra special at the end of 1598, when the company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, they dismantled their playhouse, which was in those days called the Theatre, and it was in Shoreditch in North London. And over the Christmas period, while their landlord was away, starting on the 28th of December, they took the timbers, they stored them, and then later they used them to build or reassemble their playhouse as the Globe Playhouse in Southwark, South London. And I'm just using this image here, Seawater Hodges. It's quite an old image, but I don't think his work's ever been surpassed. Giving the cross section to give a kind of indication of how complex that process might have been. The logistics of this enterprise, to me, are amazing to contemplate. But I think given this act of recycling, it is likely that everyone in the theatre company really knew the wooden instrument that was their playing space in an intimate, a tactile, and a structural way. They would understand how this playhouse was put together. And in this space, they put on anti-illusionistic performances. They did not deal in realism and in terms of scenic effects. And I think that their theatre making could be described as low carbon. Now, the company would not, of course, have thought in terms of carbon budgeting, but they were aware of climate disruption. And I think perhaps the most famous moment in Shakespeare in terms of contemporary climate breakdown is in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the fairy queen Titania's very extraordinary climate catastrophe speech, which refers in vivid detail to failed harvests and seasons that have become out of kilter. I think some of these disasters are only too familiar today, and her speech seems eerily prophetic. It is also very difficult to perform. It's one of those moments where there's a lot of action going on, and then she has, the performer, a boy player in the original, has to stand and deliver the speech. It's almost an aria, but then there's a pause for the audience to really listen to what these words are saying. But Midsummer Night's Dream also provides a useful punctuation point in Shakespeare's career as a theatre maker in terms of environmental sustainability and responsibility, because this fairy-centred play, it works. The dramaturgy is one of shared experience. So I'll give you an example. The King of the Fairies, Oberon, just announces at one point, he says, "I am invisible." And he says this to the audience, and the audience accept that, even though he's quite clearly not invisible. They share with the performers in accepting something that is palpably not the case. And this contrasts very interestingly with the much more spectacular dramaturgy of a later play involving, well, maybe not fairies, non-human characters, the spirits, The Tempest, which as a play is potentially much more voracious in terms of resource consumption. Now, one of the reasons that Shakespeare's dramaturgy was changing is because the his company began to play at the indoors Blackfriars Theatre in 1609. And their theatre making started shifting in the direction of spectacle, illusion, scenery. Even indoors, you could do stage lighting, you could use candles. And the company were beginning a journey towards what I would identify as modern performance practices. The move overall in much of theatre history is from low carbon, as in the Greek amphitheatre, the Japanese no stage, and the early Elizabethan playhouse, to high carbon, the 19th century melodramas, the mega musical, and also realism. The late 19th century, or maybe even earlier 19th century, interest in realism. And in the Tempest, I think you can see something of this shift in brief appearance of the spirit Ariel, like to a nymph of the sea. And the plot does not require this, the action does not require this, and no character can see Ariel apart from his master Prospero. I mean, Prospero is actually spelling that out here. So this moment must theatrically be grounded in pleasure, the pleasure associated with spectacular consumption, the appearance of the apparition, as Prospero says. So I'd like to nominate this stage direction as the most environmentally irresponsible stage direction in the whole of Shakespeare, because this is just excess, this is expense, use of resource that does nothing apart from create a very brief spectacular effect. I will also remind you that spectacle and special effects got Shakespeare's company into trouble around about the time of The Tempest. The firing of a cannon during performance of Henry VIII, some of the wadding got stuck into the thatch roof, and the playhouse burnt down. And I just think if you'd been involved in reassembling that playhouse and building it, just watching that burn down, I mean, there were also casualties, so I'm not making light of that, but when you've rebuilt that playhouse, that must have been extraordinary to watch. So what I'm talking about here is a move from theatre making that is grounded in an agreement between audience and performers that the audience will, as the first chorus of Henry V puts it, on their imaginary forces work, that they will imagine stuff on stage. But now Shakespeare's company were delivering more and more spectacle, and spectacle continues to be alluring in theatre and film. I feel a bit foolish speaking to an Indian audience about spectacle in film, but I mean, obviously that is one place where spectacle is very, very seductive in many a Bollywood film. Right, this kind of notion of realism and spectacle and imagining a space is particularly relevant because I want to look at the staging environmentally, the environmental challenges posed by the Countess Olivia's garden in Twelfth Night. So this is an image, as it says, of an Elizabethan garden. So I think it's interesting when trees are involved on stage, when non-human life comes into focus, and there is an opportunity, an invitation to think differently about staging particular environments. But crucially, when you work from Shakespeare's text of Twelfth Night, it's very hard to get a sense of the Countess's garden as a real garden. Now, I could disappear here into a cultural history of gardens and lawns and parks. I'm not going to do that. But I think it's very interesting that at this time, you know, gardens, they're a domesticated form of wildness. They're tamed, they're curated, they're a designed environment. And in the Countess Olivia's household, perhaps the garden is more controlled than her house, which is full of disruptive characters. Now, in early performances at the Globe Playhouse and at the Middle Temple, the Inns of Court, where a performance was recorded in 1601-2, Shakespeare's words would have created the garden environment. You're in a garden because you're being told we're in a garden. That is how the garden environment is primarily created. But of course, over the years since then, countless design teams have had to evoke the garden in many, many different ways, and often to represent the space that is Olivia's garden visually and physically. So I suppose it's interesting to me to look at what the text actually requires. Twelfth Night is a big house play, a bit like a kind of Chekhov play. Many scenes are notionally set in Olivia's house, but some absolutely do need to be in the garden. And this image I chose, Kenilworth, Warwickshire, is not that far from Stratford upon Avon. So this is not the garden that was there at the time, but the castle is run by English Heritage, who I trust to have done their research, and when they call it an Elizabethan garden, I trust them. But we're in a garden at one point in the play, and we also require a box tree. So Maria says, "Get ye all three into the box tree." All three men can get into the box tree in order to eavesdrop onto Malvolio. So I feel I have to diverge here and say that my Metal of India is a compliment. It's referring to gold. India there stands for gold. But I also just want to note that I'm constantly perplexed and intrigued by the fact that many UK-based productions of Twelfth Night have Indianized the play in different ways. There are two references to India, one to India and one to the Indies in Twelfth Night. And I suppose that on the page, India does look a little bit like the word Illyria, which is where the play is notionally set. But I am really not sure why this Indianization of Twelfth Night has happened. So if anyone's got any ideas on that, I'd be very, very interested. Anyway, back to Olivia's garden. So the box tree has to be substantial enough or big enough for three men to hide in. That is a big box tree, so that they can eavesdrop on the pompous steward Malvolio. And during the height of the 19th century fashion for pictorial Shakespeare, this location of Olivia's garden inspired some extraordinary grand scenic effects. So, for example, the American director Augustin Daly, his production had, and I'm just quoting here, house right with high porch and steps and platforms, plus a painted grand cloth and a garden gate, iron railings, grass mats, and flower bed pieces put in front of the bushes. It takes quite a while to get a set like that on stage and, of course, to get it off again. So such set and resource heavy productions often then made the decision that as many scenes as possible would be located in Olivia's garden, because once you'd got that scenery on stage, you didn't actually want to be moving it on and off again. But what I think is really important is that this staging is actually fighting the dramaturgy of the play. There does need to be something, maybe a box tree, but many productions have created a great deal of comedy without actually bringing on a representation of a box tree on stage. For example, the box tree is turned into a line of washing, it's turned into a swimming pool, it's turned into statues, it's turned into all sorts of things. And in early performances at the Globe, the eavesdroppers could easily have used the balcony, or they could have used the pillars. They could have moved around from one pillar to another. And the latter solution would allow for the eavesdroppers to get really dangerously close to Malvolio, who they're eavesdropping on. And when they're exasperated by his comments, to be very nearly caught. And that's the source of the comedy in this scene, nearly being caught, but not quite being caught. And a television film of Twelfth Night made in 2003, directed by Tim Supple, which interestingly made Viola and Sebastian both Indian in a multicultural production. This had the eavesdroppers watching Malvolio via a security camera, which was very logical and made so much sense, but it completely drained the scene of any comedy because there was no chance that Malvolio would realise what was going on. So the risk element disappeared, and so did the comedy. Okay, so pragmatically speaking, because the Globe was so close to being a theatre in the round, bringing on a box tree, a substantial box tree, big enough to have three men in it, would also risk blocking a lot of sight lines. Now, I mean, the Elizabethans did not have modern sensibilities about this, but that would need something quite substantial. And we do know that the rival company to Shakespeare, Philip Henslow's company, owned several stage trees. So the box tree might have been represented on the early modern stage by something similar to Philip Henslow's stage trees. But bringing on items like this also eats up playing time in performance. And I think really, again, Midsummer Night's Dream offers some insight here. Literalism in staging is ridiculed in A Midsummer Night's Dream because it is the theatrically unsophisticated, like the performers of the inner play, Pyramus and Thisbe, who are literal in their thinking about representing nature in a performance. In their case, it's moonlight. How do we represent moonlight? They discuss opening a casement window and letting in moonlight if the moon shines that night. And they are appearing foolish because of that, because actually, you know, it's moonlight in one of the scenes in Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's on the Globe stage and it's the afternoon. So obviously their solution is not seen to be one that the theatre company would adopt. So the dramaturgy of Midsummer Night's Dream primarily trusts Shakespeare's words to set the scenes. Now, I will say that sometimes in Shakespeare, trees are real, or at least bits of trees. The branches of Burnham Wood are asked for in Macbeth when Malcolm instructs, let every soldier hew him down a bough for camouflage. And then that is later followed by the instruction, your leafy screens throw down. That really does suggest that people came on stage carrying bits of tree. And I think Richard Power's 2018 novel, The Overstory, is very useful here, looking at Macbeth from the point of view of the oak trees. They are commenting of a performance of Macbeth. Many living things were harmed in the making of this production. And of course, on one level, we all know, it's stating the obvious, many living things, particularly trees, have been harmed in the making of many theatre productions over the centuries. And I'm not quite sure what we can do with that piece of information, but what I am interested in is when resource goes into creating Olivia's garden realistically on stage, because suddenly there are a whole load of ironies and even inconsistencies and even moments of total craziness. So there's a picture from Trevor Nunn's film of Twelfth Night, and we can see a bit of a garden. Sorry? Sorry, can you not see?
You please continue. Sorry.
Okay. So that's a picture of Helena Bonham Carter. I've called her Helen there. Her name is Helena. And you can see, well, I think you can see box tree in the background, but you can see some notion of a garden. And so this would work very well for Act 2, Scene 5. And then the next scene, and because we have to remember scene divisions are not Shakespeare's, they're the ones that are imposed in the folio. So the next scene, Act 3, Scene 1, also appears to be in the garden because Olivia gives the command, let the garden door be shut. So that suggests that there's an enclosed space in the garden that has, you know, it's kind of walled garden with a door. And this is so that she can have a private conversation with Viola dressed as the boy Cesario. And then there's a very, very long scene, Act 3, Scene 4 is how it's labelled these days. And that does have to be outside the house. So presumably the garden would be a good place to have it. And that's because the comic duel between Andrew and Cesario is fought there. And Cesario does consider, he says, she says, they say, returning to the house to ask for Olivia's protection. We also get the detail that Andrew is sent off to look for Cesario at the corner of the orchard. So we know Olivia's got an orchard. And that's an image from the same very realistic film. So there's a potential for a garden gate. The comic duel is then interrupted by the sea captain, possibly pirate, Antonio, who interrupts and offers to fight on behalf of Cesario. And then Antonio is arrested by the Duke Orsino's men. And I'm just going to point out, I think you can just see that in this film, the Countess Olivia even has croquet, a croquet lawn. You can just see the hoops there. The reason that I've been using images from this particular film, it is a bit unfair because it's a ravishingly beautiful film in many, many ways, but it's because its realism is so pronounced. Trevor Nunn, the director, creates a coherent, consistent kind of Cornish coast environment. You can imagine wrecks off the coast of Cornwall, and it is, as I say, it's extraordinarily beautiful. But in Act 3, Scene 4, Nunn has to invent a whole load of action to explain what on earth's going on. Because the minute you start asking logical questions about the staging, you have to say, what is Antonio doing in Olivia's garden, which was, you know, before a private space? And after you've asked that question, the next question is, how on earth did Orsino's officers get into Olivia's garden? It's quite interesting to see how he creates a little sort of story to explain this rather sort of unexpected event. Now, I will just say Act 3, Scene 4 is also the scene in which Fabian says of a servant character says of the setup for this comic duel, he says, if this were played upon a stage now, I could condemn it as an improbable fiction. And I think when there's a line like that in the scene, we do understand that we are not in the realm of realism. And of course, my point is that the sense of the environment that is Olivia's garden, when it's on stage, it's not only primarily created through Shakespeare's words, but it is also fluid and flexible, and it moves. Olivia's private garden morphs into a much more public space. There is no explanation, there's no transition, it just happens. Now, these spatial gymnastics are nothing compared to the dramaturgy practiced by the Caroline playwright Richard Broome, who I've done a lot of work on. It's been very interesting to put Broome, who's not terribly well known nowadays, alongside Shakespeare. Broome will often, within a scene, be indoors and then be outdoors and then be indoors again, without a scene break, without any notice to the audience that locations have moved. He is not interested in a stable or environment being created on stage. So all this provides an important reminder that Shakespeare is not writing at this stage in his life for his locations to be realized in spectacular or visual terms. Okay, so for me and my students, we're left with the question of how can theatre makers today respond creatively to Shakespeare's dramaturgy and also to challenge some of the assumptions of the theatre industry. Now, many in the theatre industry are working very hard to bring in considerations of environmental sustainability, but theatre is often a voracious consumer of resource. So how can theatre makers make their practice more environmentally sustainable and responsible without losing quality in terms of production values? And that's really the very, very big question. Crucially, how do they do this without abandoning the very real pleasure of spectacle? Now, it's easier for my students in some ways because student theatre is so often frugal in its use of resources. That's a polite way of saying underfunded. But one thing my students are doing is we're all together trying to work with the Theatre Green Book. Now, this is a freely available online resource, and it's been used by the UK's National Theatre for a couple of years now. And this year, there's been a test run with the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre of Scotland, and a community theatre based in Exeter called Theatre Alibi. The Theatre Green Book is, I think, a wonderful resource for any theatre makers, and it's been put together primarily by designers. I think that sometimes designers really get to carry the can. They get all the responsibility in terms of making theatre more environmentally sustainable. And I think that might be a little bit unfair sometimes, but theatre designers in Britain have got together to create the Theatre Green Book. And what they have got here is a whole kind of series of resources. There's everything from staging, a very small scale show to running a large theatre, even a historically significant theatre, which means that you can't start putting solar panels all over the roof. And so what we'll be doing in working on the Theatre Green Book is seeing what words of wisdom it has to offer as we struggle with the exciting challenge of creating the Countess Olivia's garden on stage. Thank you. I need to stop sharing my screen.